Hey, something else that's been going on today is my parents are in town. They're sitting right over there. They always like it when I point them out in crowds of people. And so they're here with us today, and so it's been nice to have them. And they got in yesterday, and so it's been nice to be having them in town. And, the grandkids, of course, love it because they just stopped talking to us, and everything's grandma and grandpa now. And that actually works out pretty well for Tamara and I, too. And so... Well, hey, last week we began a new series called Prodigals, and that's all based on Luke 15 and the story of the prodigal son. You might remember the story, but if I can, let me just paraphrase the story for you real quick. We won't put it up on the board. I'm just going to tell you the story. The story begins that there was a man who had two sons, and one of them, the younger son, approached his father one day and said, "Dad, can I have my inheritance?" Which was just a nice way of saying, "Dad, you're worth more to me dead than alive," okay? Now, typically, if anyone came to you and said, "Hey, can I have your stuff when you're dead, but can I have it now?" What would the answer be? No. I mean, I could try it right now with my dad, but I already know where that's going to go. I can't ask for my inheritance early, right? But here's the wild thing in the story. What does the father do? He gives it to him. He gives him his part of the inheritance. And so what the son does then is he goes off into another country. He spends it all. A famine hits. And basically, because he has nothing now, he's reduced to poverty. He starts working at a pig farm, which for Jews was just insulting. And he's reduced to begging for pig slop. And he gets so desperate, he's just at wit's end. He doesn't know what else to do. He finally comes to the realization of, you know what, maybe I can go home. He says, maybe I can go home. And he doesn't expect to go home and be his dad's son, because he's like, that ship has sailed. I've messed that up. But maybe I could go back and be my dad's servant. Maybe my dad will just give me a job and it will put food on the table. And so he goes home expecting the worst, expecting probably just to get run out of the house. But instead, when he gets home, it says that his dad runs out to his son. He grabs onto him, holds on to him for dear life, and says, "Finally, my son is home." It's like he was lost and now he's found. It's like he was dead and now he's alive. And he gives him everything back. And he throws him a party, it says. That's what it says. It literally says they threw him a party. There's music, there's dancing, because he's so excited that his son is home. This story is a well-known story. A lot of people already know this story, and it's really a touching story. It's a nice, feel-good story. Oh, man, the son came home, and it all worked out. It sounds really good until you realize who Jesus is talking about in the story. He's not just talking about some wayward son who rebelled against his parents. He's talking about the people who are around him. And the reason Jesus is telling the story is because in Luke 15, 1 through 2, it says that now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near Jesus to listen to him. Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, "This man receives sinners and welcomes them." Okay, just again, a little perspective on who these two groups are. Tax collectors are not just people who took a little bit of extra money off the top. Like sometimes we paint tax collectors as much nicer people than they actually were. Tax collectors were people who were collecting money so that the Roman army who overthrew Jerusalem could stay. Think about this. Another country would come in, let's say it came into America, overthrew us, killed our people, raped our women, robbed us, and now someone, another American citizen, is now going around collecting money so they can stay. That's what a tax collector was. And so when Jesus here is saying that these tax collectors are this young son, and the Pharisees were religious leaders who ruled over them. They were the holy of holy. Like, how many of you feel like, I'm not that bad of a guy? Yeah, like, I'm pretty good. I do nice things for people. I get the door for people. I'm a good person. Well, as good as you might think you are, the Pharisees are better than you. That's just, and I'm not even meaning that facetiously. I mean, the Pharisees are better than you. They're holier than you. They pray more than you. They read the Bible more than you. They live better than you. They don't mess up like you do. They are better than you, okay? And so Jesus has these two groups of people here. And he's suggesting that just as the Pharisees are sons of God, so are the tax collectors. He's saying that God loves and forgives the people like that. And so what Jesus is saying here is more than a story. This is a scandal. It's a scandal to take two people who are so different, someone who's like a Benedict Arnold to the country and someone who's like a George Washington to the country, and like he's saying, oh yeah, God loves them the same. They're equals. They're both sons. What are you talking about, Jesus? How could you dare compare these? No one would have ever put these two people in the same story, let alone in the same family. And so the Pharisees are hating the story because it goes against the entire narrative that they've painted against the tax collectors. It goes against everything they would teach about God. Jesus was saying something that no one else would have ever said. And honestly, if we think about the story in that context, the story might rub us the wrong way too. It might rub us the wrong way too, because when we read the Bible, we read a lot about righteousness and holiness. We could see all over the Bible, there's these things, these laws, there's justice. That's this whole, we got this picture of this perfect God, and we have these pictures of people doing the wrong thing, people doing the right thing. And so it's easy for us to think that Jesus somehow lands in the middle of the Bible and tells a story like this, and that it totally contradicts everything else we know about God. Like the rest of the Bible, it's like law, 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 law. Jesus says, well, hey, I'm going to forgive the guy who broke all the laws. And it's like, whoa, Jesus, what are you doing? That's not how the story goes. You're messing up the story. Like, how can anyone really believe a story like, it's a nice story, right? But how can anyone actually believe it? But here's the thing we have to realize when Jesus is telling the story of the prodigal son. He's not just making up a story off the top of his head. He's not just going against everything that's ever been written in the Bible. He's not just making up a spiritual allegory. Jesus is repeating a Bible story that has been told over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament. When Jesus says in Luke 15:11, there was a man who had two sons, right then, every single person in that room should have known what Jesus was talking about. Right then. Because Jesus began to tell the story of Jacob and Esau. And that's where we're going to be today. In Genesis 25, we read about a couple named Isaac and Rebekah. And Isaac was the son of Abraham. If you remember the story of Abraham, Abraham at one point had to take his son on the mountain and offer him up as a sacrifice. It's Isaac. He made it. He survived. He lived through all that. but he's married, and he's got a family, and it says that Isaac and Rebekah were having kids. And in Genesis 25, 24 through 26, it says that when her days to be delivered, Rebekah's pregnant, when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came forth red, all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. This is in the Bible, I'm not making this up. After his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, and so his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. Okay, so in other words, the story begins, there was a man who had two sons. There was a man who had two sons. Now, let me describe them to you, because these guys were only fraternal twins. They were not identical twins. Verse 27 says that when the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. Okay, so Esau was basically the perfect son. He was the perfect son. He was responsible, he was obedient, he was respectful, and he was the jock of the family. Like, he could do everything. It says he was a man of the field. It says he was a hunter. He was strong. He was a man's man. And it says he was hairy. And I want you to understand how hairy he was. Like, when I was in junior high school, there was a kid I went to high school named Mike Valekos, and he was shaving since the time he was 10. Like, he was a really hairy guy. But this guy has nothing on, Mike has nothing on Esau. It says that when Esau came out, his hair was like a garment. Like, they didn't even have to put clothes on the kid. He had so much hair, And so Esau was basically like Elmo on steroids. That's it. That's all you need to know. This is Esau, okay? He's huge. It's amazing what you find on the internet. But besides being a Muppet, he was a perfect son. you know? And so Jacob, on the other hand, it says, was a peaceful man. And that was a very nice way of saying he was a pansy. That is. That's all it was. Like, these two are total contrast with each other. Esau is the man. It says Jacob was a peaceful man. He lived in tents. Basically, while Esau slept outside, Jacob never left the house. He never left the house. He stayed indoors all the time. He was basically a little spoiled. And so no one would ever guess that these two guys were related. No one, let alone twins, right? Now, Isaac was pretty old when they were born, but now he's getting a little older. And everyone thought, man, any day now, Isaac is going to die. Isaac's been in bed the whole time. His eyesight is shot. He can barely see. He's just relying on sounds to know who's what, and sounds and touch to know what's going on. And so everyone's getting ready to say goodbye to Isaac. And Isaac is getting ready, essentially, to read his will. Even Isaac thinks, any day now I'm going to die. And so he's getting ready to read his will. And back in that day, if you had two sons, the way inheritance worked was that the older son got 2/3 of the inheritance, and the younger son got 1/3. It didn't matter if you were older by 5 years or 5 minutes. It did not matter. Older is older. So the older son got the principal portion of the inheritance. And Rebekah, their mom, really likes Jacob more than Esau. He's been at home more. He's the mama's boy. He's been staying around. And so she's trying to find some way to give Jacob the bigger chunk of the inheritance. And so while Esau is out trying to prepare Isaac a favorite dish, because that's what they were going to do. They were going to come into Isaac. They were going to give him a last meal to say, hey, I cooked you something nice. Now it's time to read your will. What do you want? Where do you want your money to go? Where do you want your property to go? And so while he's out hunting and trying to prepare Isaac's favorite dish, she gets Jacob. She hands him a meal for Isaac. And then she covers him, it says, in goat hair. Which, man, if you don't think that Esau is hairy, she's taking goat hair and she's slapping it on Jacob, thinking this is a good enough costume to fool Isaac. Like, that's a special kind of hairy, right? And so Jacob goes into his dad dressed as Esau. Isaac falls for it, and he gives Jacob the larger part of the inheritance. And now you can see how the story of the prodigal son is playing out. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger came into the father and said, can I have my inheritance? It's the prodigal son playing out. It's the same story. And just like the story, Isaac gives it to him. And what's wild about that is Isaac finds out not long after this that Jacob lied to him. Esau comes in and he's got his meal. He's like, okay, Dad, I'm ready for you to bless me. And when he gets there, Isaac's like, whoa, what do you mean? I already blessed you. And Esau says, no, I've been out in the field. I've been hunting. I've been preparing this. And Isaac puts 2 and 2 together and says, your brother cheated me. And Esau says, well, we can undo it. He lied, right? And look at what it says in 27:37. He says, no, I've already made him your master. I've already put all of his relatives, and I've given to him all the servants, and I've given him all the grain and the new wine. I've already given him everything. I've already given him your inheritance. Even though he knows that Jacob's lied to him, he still gives it to him. He still gives it to him. That's the grace of God right there. Like, even when we're not good to God, God is still good to us. Even when we're not faithful, God is still faithful. God does not go back on his word just because we do. He knows Jacob lied to him, but he still gives it to him. And when Esau finds out, he's ticked. Like, it's on like Donkey Kong, okay? Because he's not just going to beat his brother when he sees him. He's going to murder him. Like, he's going to wait a little bit because any day now, Dad's going to die. He's not going to kill Jacob before his dad dies. But after his dad dies and after the funeral, you bet he's going to murder him. And he's not even keeping it a secret. He's not even pretending like he's not going to kill him. Like, everyone in the camp knows there's going to be 2 funerals soon. Jacob's going to die. And so Jacob's mom tells him to run for his life because even she knows that this is not a fight that Jacob can win. And so she makes up a story about why Jacob has to go on a trip, you know. It's kind of like the kids, the kids are going to pick him on him at school. It's, oh, we got a doctor's appointment. We're just going to pick him up early so he doesn't get beat up, Like she's trying to make up this story for how to get Jacob out of the house. And so the idea she has is, hey, Jacob really needs to find a wife. So why don't we just send him away? He'll find a wife and then he can come back. And Isaac allows him to go. And Jacob runs for his life. And just like the story of the prodigal son, he leaves the country and he goes and he stays with his uncle Laban, which this is a story in itself. We don't have time to get into all the details of his time with his uncle Laban, but let me just give you a brief history of what happened there. During that time, Jacob actually ends up marrying 2 of Laban's daughters at the same time, which that's always a good idea, by the way. Get married to multiple women at the same time and make sure they're related, because that's a formula for happiness right there. But Jacob worked for Laban for 7 years to marry his younger daughter Rachel. And when he thought he was marrying the younger one, it says Laban switched the younger one for the older one on the wedding night. And just in case you wonder, how in the world could that happen? Wouldn't you notice a difference? You got to remember, at night, there's no electricity in tents, okay? So when Laban switches his daughters, which just shows you he's just a wonderful father, he switches his daughters. It's not till the next morning that Jacob has any idea that he's been cheated. He didn't want to marry Leah. Genesis 29:17 says that her eyes were weak. That's a nice way of saying she was ugly. She was not pretty. Like, have you ever heard the term like a butterface? You know that? Like, she's got a great body, but her face. That's Leah. I'm not making this up. This is a Bible story. Okay? So to still marry Rachel, who he wanted, Laban makes him work another 7 years. If you wonder where Jacob got his shiftiness from, it's his mom's side of the family. But for 20 years, basically, Jacob works under his uncle in a far-off land like a slave, and his uncle cheated him time and time again. He cheated him when it came to his wives, and it cheated him when it came to his wages. Look at Genesis 31. He says, Laban has cheated me and changed my wages. I should have had an S there, 10 times. 10 times. How many of you, like your work doesn't give you what you say, and you're like, well, I'm already done? He's cheated him 10 times, okay? This is getting old. This is getting old. He didn't want to be there anymore, but he didn't really have anywhere else to go. And it's at this point that God says in Genesis 31:3, it says, now the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. God says, Jacob, it's time for you to come home. It's time for you to stop running. It's time for you to go back home. It's time for you to go back to where Isaac is. It's time for you to go back where Jacob is, or where Esau is. And of course, that's what Jacob wants to do. For 20 years, he's been away from home, right? That's a long time. That's a long time. But look what he says in chapter 32, verse 9 through 11. He says, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. I am unworthy of all the loving kindness and of all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him that he will come and attack me and the mothers with the children. He says, man, I want nothing more than to go home. But I can't go back there. I can't go back there. Not after what I've done. I'm not worthy to even be there. I'm not even worthy. Look at how he describes himself in this passage. He says, you've been faithful to me. You've loved me. I'm barely a servant to you. That sounds exactly like the story of the prodigal son, right? You know, he says, I want to go back to the father, but man, I can only be a servant. And he says, man, my brother Esau, when I show up, he's going to kill me. Like, if I'm going to go back home, God, you're going to have to do something about him. I think that's a scary thing to go home after 20 years, don't you? Like, I don't even want to go back to a high school reunion. Like, I'm sure that, like, Mike Valakos has gone to, like, being like a Wookiee now. But it's more than that. Like, so much has changed in my life since that time, you know? I'm not the person I was back then. And, like, are they going to remember who I was, or are they going to think about me for who I am now, you know? Like, I'm a dad now. I'm a pastor now. I'm a husband now. Like, I'm not that kid anymore. I'm not that person anymore. That's intimidating to go back into that setting and wonder which me is going to be accepted. Which me are they going to look at? And in Jacob's life, that's a big question for him. 20 years have gone by. He's not the same guy. He's married. He's got 11 kids at this point. He's been successful away from home. He's become a good guy. But none of that changes what he did to Esau. You know, as far as he is back there, he's still that guy. He's still the guy who hosed his brother Esau. But Jacob still goes home, and he almost arrives, and it says Esau is waiting for him. And this is really an intimidating picture, because it actually says that when Esau comes out to meet him, he has 400 men with him. That's like, uh-oh. Maybe we should turn around. We've clearly gotten off at the wrong place. We meant to take a left instead of a right. I apologize. I'm going to leave. But look what it says in Genesis 33, verse 4. It says that Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. This is word for word how Jesus describes the father and the prodigal son. Word for word. I mean, this is a plot twist. You know, Esau welcomes Jacob home like nothing ever happened. Like, clearly something happened, right? There's been a problem. But that's not the way Esau welcomes him. He welcomes him home like he's been missing for 20 years. He welcomes him home like, I thought you were dead. He wanted to kill him. Like, thinking he was dead would have been a blessing, right? Like, well, mission accomplished. No, he welcomes him home like that's the last thing he wanted. And not only that, Jacob finds out a lot's changed while he was gone. His mother, Rebekah, had died. But you know who's still alive? Isaac. The guy he left on his deathbed is still alive 20 years later. Like, talk about reading that wrong. He's like, man, Esau's going to kill me when my dad dies. He's still not dead. And Jacob and Esau and Isaac actually get to spend years together, renewing their relationship. Years. And what might be the most important verse in the whole story is in Genesis 35:29. It says that Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Esau and Jacob buried their father. That's huge. That's huge. Because this doesn't just say, hey, they met and they had a one-time meeting. It means they spent years together. And when Dad died, the first thing they did was work together to do that funeral. Both of Isaac's sons are together and brothers again when he dies. Isaac gets to die with his family intact. Isaac gets to die with his family at peace. That's huge. That's huge. And this is the story that Jesus wants the Pharisees to remember as he tells the story of the prodigal son. He wants them to remember that God as a father wants his kids home, but he also wants them to remember that they're a part of the story too. Remember, the story of the prodigal son is not just about the son who left home. How does the story start? Luke 15:1. There was a man who what? Had 2 sons. The story is not really about the younger brother. That's not what the story, like we make that mistake all the time. It's like, oh man, and this guy got to come home. That's not why Jesus is telling the story. We have to remember why Jesus is saying there are 2 sons. Luke 15:1 and 2 says that there were 2 parties there, right? There are the sinners, there's the tax collectors, and there's the Pharisees, right? There's the righteous, there's the wicked. There's the good, there's the bad. The younger son is all the tax collectors. Jacob is the tax collectors. And the Pharisees, that's Esau, the older son who never left home. And Jesus is telling the story of the prodigal son. He's telling the story of Jacob and Esau because he wants the Pharisees to remember what happened with Jacob and Esau. He wants them to remember that Esau forgave Jacob. The story of the prodigal son is not a new story Jesus is telling. He's not reinventing the way the Bible talks about God. He's showing us this is the way that God has always been. The story of the prodigal son for the Israelites was the foundation of their nation. Jacob goes on, he gets a new name from God. You know what his new name is? Israel. That's why we call Israel Israel, because that's the new name God gives Jacob. Israel. When Jesus is telling the story of the prodigal son, he is going back to the formation of their nation. He's going back to their constitution. This is the origin of everything about them. This is literally the genesis of their faith. That Jacob was forgiven and still blessed by the Father. That's the relationship that they have with God. And he's telling a story the Pharisees have memorized and known and preached for centuries. They knew the story and they were missing. They were forgetting the entire point. Jesus had all of these prodigal sons around him, ready to come home, and the Pharisees hated it. And Jesus is saying, guys, you have to remember what this story is all about. You have to remember why we're even here today. You have to remember that this all started back with Jacob and Esau. And you got to remember, just as Jacob came home, these people are now ready to come home. You got to remember how Esau was. You got to remember how we need to act, how we need to live. And the Pharisees, essentially, though, were nothing like Esau. They had missed the whole story. They'd preached Jacob and Esau, but they weren't living Jacob and Esau. They weren't buying what they were selling. And we'll get into the rest of the story this next week, but what it goes into is a brother, the other brother in the story of the prodigal son, who wants nothing to do with the prodigal son who's come home. And we'll get into that more next week. But it wasn't a story they were believing, because it wasn't a story they were living. But you know, as much as the Pharisees weren't ready to forgive, honestly, I'm not sure we're much better. I think for a long time, churches have been good at selling a story of forgiveness and not buying it. Like, we know that the church is supposed to be about forgiveness, right? Like, how can you miss it, right? We do communion. What's that about? Jesus died, he rose again. Why? To forgive us. Like, that's the genesis of our faith, that God forgives us. We take communion every week just to remember that. And we say things like, Jesus died for everyone. Anyone could be saved. But let me ask you, how many of you really feel like you're forgiven? Like, have you ever had moments where you're like, yeah, it's nice to think that I'm forgiven, but I don't feel very forgiven? Have you ever felt that way? Like, I know so many people who are more like Jacob and the prodigal son. It's nice to think we can go home. It's nice to think we can be forgiven. But man, Esau's just waiting to kill me. I can't go back after what I did. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like, man, I would really like to mend fences with some people? And it's like, yeah, but they're never going to do this. Not after what I did. Not after what's happened. Prodigal son's a nice story, but that stuff just never happens. And the reason Jesus is telling the story, sometimes I think we listen to the stories of Jesus and we say, that's a nice story. We think more like Aesop's fables, like there's the ant and the grasshopper, and oh, that's nice. The tortoise and the hare, oh, that's nice. But like when we look at reality, we say that stuff doesn't exist. And we listen to Jesus, it's like, man, it would be wonderful if the world worked this way. But that's not the way the world works. And Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son. And the way he tells it, and he's telling the story of Jacob and Esau, he's telling it that way so that people can remember this isn't just a fairy tale. This is history. This is the history of how God works with his people. He says, God does want you home. Just look at Jacob. But I've thought about this for a while, and I think the reason we have a hard time feeling like we can be forgiven is because the church has not always had a culture of forgiveness. Like I think people have a hard time thinking they can be forgiven, even here, because that's not the way we are. I mean, I can look at my own life, and I can talk about forgiveness, but like if you were to know everything in my life and to bring up certain people in my life, it'd be like, well, except that guy. like that guy's a jerk. But for the rest of people, like whatever people have done to you, well, you need to forgive that, but it's not as bad as what people have done to me. You know what I'm saying? Like we have those people in our life. We have those situations. And because I'm like that, sometimes it's like, why would I ever believe I can be forgiven? Because I don't really forgive people. I don't really let stuff go. I mean, why would I expect anyone to be any different than me? And there was a time that Jesus talked about. He was talking about praying, but at the end of talking about praying, he said in Matthew 6:14, if you forgive others of their transgressions, your heavenly Father will forgive you too. And on the one hand, I think Jesus is saying that God's been good to you, so don't be a hard-hearted jerk. Like I think Jesus is saying, hey, God's forgiveness means you have to forgive. I think that there's that element. But on the other hand, I think Jesus is teaching us something about the relationship of forgiveness and how we can feel forgiven as we forgive others. And I think the more that we forgive others, I think the more we understand and experience God's forgiveness of us. Like, for me, really, I don't think I really could grasp how much God has forgiven me until I started to actually let go of the things that people have done to me. Like, it was nice to talk about it. It's kind of like, yeah, I'm forgiven, but I don't know that I've really done anything that bad. But the more that I started to forgive people for the stuff that they'd done to me, the stuff that I thought was bad, the more I began to realize this is the same stuff I've done against other people, and this is the same stuff I've done against God. And the way I've just let go of that is the way that God's letting go of that in my life. I was beginning to understand the relationship of forgiveness in the way that I was learning to forgive. It's kind of like how in 1 John it says that if we don't love people, we can't grasp what it means to love God. How do you love a God you don't see if you don't love the people you do see? How do you really grasp the forgiveness of God if you're not forgiving the people around you? And so if you're struggling to feel like God has forgiven you, I want to challenge you to forgive someone who's really hurt you. And this can be anyone. All of us have baggage, right? Like that's the thing. The more I talk to people, the more I learn that we all have baggage. Like some of us just dress it up a little bit better. But like if you were to know the secret lives of people and the things they went through, we would be like, geez, Like we all have, that's who we are. We're all broken. We all have baggage. And I mean, this can be with family members. This could be with friends. This could be with whoever has damaged us. And this isn't an easy thing to do. Like I said, it's really easy to talk about how other people need to forgive, but it's another thing to really forgive. C.S. Lewis said, the idea of forgiveness is a lovely thing until you have something to forgive. I have never had people get more mad at me than when I tell them, you need to forgive someone. Like that's something actually in our youth group, we set out a challenge to bring equality between people, just to talk about stand up for someone and try to create peace between people. Like just go on the internet, and when people are really just bashing on someone, say something loving and peaceful and just see what happens. Have you been on the internet? It's not a friendly place. It's pretty brutal. Like you say anything and people will jump on it. Like you say a nice thing, well, except this. You know, it's like, geez, can't I just say something nice? No. No, you can't, because the internet hates you. That's the internet default. But that's the thing. You say, let's have peace, and everyone hates you. You say, let's bury the hatchet, and people get mad. People get mad. But here's the thing I think we have to recognize about forgiveness if we're ever going to do this. Because there's a lot of things that upset us when this idea of forgiveness comes up. And the first thing we have to recognize is that forgiveness is not about what's fair. Forgiveness is not about what's fair. This is probably the thing that I hear first. Well, that's not fair. You're right. It's not about what's fair. Forgiveness is not about what's fair. This is not about justice. Like sometimes people, they always want justice when it comes to them, right? You know, well, but I want someone to stand up for me like this. I want this to be taken care of. Forgiveness is not about justice. Like if this was really about justice, if we wanted to go to an entirely justice system, none of us want that, because none of us would be able to stand before the justice of God. That's the thing we got to understand. The cross is the most unfair thing that's ever happened. A guy who's totally innocent gets murdered because of what we've done. But if that doesn't happen, we're not forgiven. This is not about justice. You do not want the justice of God. And forgiveness is not about forgetting. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. Say that. Forgiveness is about forgetting. It's not about pretending that everything's okay. Forgiveness is not about pretending that everything's okay. I'm pretty sure Jesus still remembers dying on the cross. You know? I don't think like we're going to get to heaven and we're going to be like, hey, thanks for dying for me. Sorry about that. And I don't think he's going to be like, what? What are you talking about? I don't remember that at all. He's going to be acutely aware of what's happened there, you know? Like, that's not what it is. It's not about forgetting. It's not about ignoring that. And forgiveness does not mean it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean that everything goes back to normal. Like, sometimes I think that's like that we're just pretending and we're going to live and it's going to be happy and we're going to pretend like nothing's happened. Everything's okay. It doesn't mean it goes back to normal. Jesus, when he rose from the dead, forgave us, but I'm pretty sure he still had holes in his hands and holes in his feet and a hole in his side. It didn't go back to normal. Everything changed. Forgiveness does not deny anything that's happened. It accepts it all. It recognizes the pain, the hurt, and the tragedy, but what forgiveness does is it breaks the power it has over our life. And it breaks the cycle of people piling hurt upon hurt. It turns the other cheek. Like, that's the thing. Like, people think forgiveness means you're just being a pushover or you're just being a doormat. And that's not it at all. Forgiveness is all about, I know exactly what's happened to me. And I'm not going to respond to them the way that they responded to me. And it doesn't just say, hey, I'm not going to kill the guy. When Esau comes out, if forgiveness is just not, hey, I won't murder you. Real forgiveness is about being good to the people who hurt you. In the same way that God was good to you. Like, and that's the thing. People really struggle with that because they're like, oh, well, you know, I've forgiven them, but I'm just not going to have anything to do with them. I'm not going to talk to them. I'm not going to have anything be the same. And it's like, man, I really hope God doesn't forgive me like that. You know? I'd hate to get to heaven and Jesus be like, well, you're here, but stay on your side of heaven, and I'm going to go over here. Like, the whole point is to be with him. The whole point is to see him. The whole point is to have eternity with him. And sometimes I think that we think that we can excuse ourselves to not really forgive, but we still expect everything from Jesus. And that's not how it works. You know, I've talked about this before. If the way that you love your enemy is different from the way you love your friend, then you don't love your enemy. Love doesn't look different for different people. Like there's marriage love, that's different. That should look different. Jacob did not know that story. But man, if the way I treat people, if I'm saying that I love my enemy, if I'm saying that I forgive someone, and the way that I live and act and respond to them does not change and doesn't look like it goes from an enemy to a friend, then I've not forgiven that person. And again, I'm not saying it's not hard. It's insanely hard. I am not standing up here saying, man, you need to learn to forgive people like me. Don't forgive people like me. I am not the model for this. Jesus is the model. Jesus is the model. He's the one welcoming us home. But man, it's after we've begun to forgive people that we begin to believe that there's still hope for us too. It's when we start to really let go of things. It's when we start to bury the hatchets in our life. It's when we start to say, you know what? I know what this person has done to me, but I still have hope for them. That's when I think Jesus kind of taps us on the shoulder and said, yeah, you too. And so we're going to be taking communion, and this is the time when we remember what Jesus has done for us. And this is a time when we get to come before this table, we get to come before God, and we get to remember everything we've ever done. And anything that you think you've done at this table has been washed away by Jesus. And that's amazing. Because, you know, I'm a pretty open guy. Some people would say I'm a little too open. But man, if everyone had to know who I really was, if everyone had to know all my secret sins, if everyone had to know all the things that I don't even want to talk about, all the things I've experienced, I would be embarrassed to stand in front of anyone and talk. And Jesus already knows that stuff about me. And he says, come to the table. Come home. That's huge. That's life-altering. And some of you guys have been standing out at the edge of the field because you don't think that you can be forgiven. You don't think this table's for you. You think that this table's for sinners, but not sinners like you. Because, man, if people really knew who you were, if they knew what you did, you wouldn't even be welcome to sit in the building. And that's not what this table's about at all. This table's about that we are the worst of the worst. We have done everything wrong, and God still says, come home. And that's what we want you to do today. We want you to come here with all of your faults, with all of your failings, with all of the wreckage and damage of your life, and come experience the forgiveness of Jesus. But I think in order to really experience that, I think you have to be finding and identifying people in your life that you need to forgive. And I don't know anyone who doesn't need to forgive someone, you know? Anyone ever hose you? It's a Canadian way of saying it. Like, I mean, we've been there. People have hurt us. We're damaged goods. There's someone you need to forgive. And I think this is a time for you to just take and pray and to spend time thinking about those people in your life. And remembering that the way that Jesus wants you to come home is the way that Jesus wants them to come home. Your enemies are not Jesus' enemies. Jesus does not hate the people you hate. Sorry, we like to think, well, he's on my side, so you're hosed. No, Jesus is like, no, I'm on my side, and I want everyone to stand with me. And so this is a time for us to welcome those people back, to remember the lesson of Esau and Jacob, and to welcome our brothers home. And so I want you to take some time and to pray, to work through those things. And man, I have no idea what people have done to you, but I know what Jesus did for you. And that makes it worth bringing them home. And so I'm going to pray, and after I pray, Jamie's going to be playing, but come up, take communion, eat the body, drink the blood, experience the forgiveness of Jesus. If you got your tithes and offerings, this is a perfect time to put those in. Man, all of that goes to trying to reach out to prodigal sons all over this world. We're trying to make a huge difference in our community, and we're getting to see that on every level. Yesterday, our youth did an outreach. Today, our children's ministry is doing an outreach. Pretty soon, we're going to be doing Greater Andover Days, where we're going to have contact with thousands of people in Andover to try to reach them for Jesus. Like, everything that goes into this goes to the mission of the kingdom, to bring prodigal sons home, to let people know that the same forgiveness that we say we have is a forgiveness that other people can have. And so if you're ready, come up, eat the body, drink the blood, give your tithes and offerings. And if you feel like you can't come home, let's have a conversation. Whether that's got to be at a pizza with the pastor, if you want to come up here and talk with me right now, that's fine. Because, man, I cannot express to you how much Jesus wants you to come home. Like, there's things I've done to try to get people to go places. I try to be, I'm an instigator. I like to push people's buttons. I like to also guilt trip. Guilt tripping is really good. Jesus wants you to do that. That really works, People will do all kinds of things. I like to harass people. I like to say, well, I'll buy your lunch. I like to do all that stuff. But Jesus died for you to come home. I got nothing on that. And if that's not enough for you to get that you need to come home, I don't know how to convince you. And so let's talk about that. Come with all your baggage. Come with all your brokenness. Come ready to forgive. And come ready to be forgiven. Father in heaven, thank you for today. Thank you for what you do. And God, I just thank you so much that this isn't just a parable, that this isn't just a story, that this is the history of how you've worked with your people, that you have always wanted people to come home. And God, I just ask that you forgive me for all the times that I have wanted you to forgive me, but I wouldn't forgive someone else. For all the times that I've forgotten to act like Esau and I've acted like a Pharisee. God, I just pray that you would give me opportunity to let go of things that have happened to me in my life and to bring healing into the lives of others and to bring healing into the lives of people who hurt me. And God, I pray that you would help me end the destructive cycle that happens when we keep hurting each other. God, you have been nothing but good to us. You've been nothing but good to us, and your mercy is new every day, and I want to thank you so much for what we have in your Son, Jesus. I ask all these things in his name. Amen.